Bem-vindos ao painel 2, Reception and Literary Translation of Irish Literature. And today we have, first of all, Professor Marcel de Lima Santos, who holds a PhD in Literary Studies from the University of Nottingham, England, 2003. He's currently Associate Professor of Literatures in the English Language at the Federal University of Minas in Brazil. He has teaching experience in the area of letters with diverse books, translations, and scientific published works in the USA, Australia, and England, working mainly in the following themes: English literature, religion, poetry, comparative literature, and ethnopoetics. So welcome, Professor Marcel de Lima Santos. After your presentation, I will introduce our next speaker, Pedro, with your talk entitled The Legacy of the Canon in Irish Literary Translation. Oh, Irish Literary Tradition. Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
Professor
Gisele.
Santos.
Thank you all for
The floor
being
is
here.
yours.
Yes, my name is Marcel. I teach literatures in English at UFMG, and I'm sort of a newcomer to Irish studies. I've been involved with a group of Irish studies at UFRN with professors Bruce Stewart and Anna Caoineadh for a few years now. But compared to what I know from you guys, I could say I'm a neophyte in these studies. So I beg your pardon for my lack of depth in terms of this literary tradition that you've been involved with for so many years. So this work of mine deals with the Caoineadh, which is part of an age-old Irish oral tradition of panegyric poetry, if you will, in order to lament for the dead. And so I wrote this small piece that I'll try to deliver now. So the oral tradition of Celtic culture presents a rich and extensive literary corpus, comprised mostly of anonymous female authors, based on ancient legendary and poetic writings of a traditional nature. Until the mid-17th century, both Ireland and Scotland still shared a similar social structure, as well as a common language, Gaelic. In terms of literary representations, there had been a patriarchal elite of poets whose power and prestige would have been fundamentally linked to the political stability, and whose poetry basically related to the panegyric bestowed to royal figures and or clan chiefs, has been known as bardic or syllabic. According to Angela Burke, with the social political revolutions of the 17th century, the prestige of such poets declined, along with their traditional literary activity. The English language spread out, and Gaelic was then only to be found in remote rural areas, leading to a scarce formal literary production. In contrast, oral literary tradition prospered galore, namely tales, proverbs, chants, laments, elegies, poems, etc. Ever since the romantic interest in Celtic song and music, along with the consolidation of nationalism in the 19th century, a more systematic gaze upon oral traditions, incorporated into the studies of folklore, makes itself present, and in the very beginning of the 20th century, there appeared great archives throughout Europe, such as the collections directed by James H. Delage, besides the foundation of the Folklore of Ireland Society in 1927, with its respective journal Beloides, of the Irish Folklore Institute in 1930, named later as Irish Folklore Commission, which in 1971 was once more renamed as the National Folklore Collection at University College in Dublin. Hence, this paper evidences the Irish oral poetic tradition as its object of study, under the light of an ethno-poetic reconceptualization, given both the marginal nature of its compositions, associated to the rites connected to a feminine force, and the liminal quality of its interdisciplinary representations associated to the rites of passage. Jerome Rothenberg proposes to formulate a poetics in the context of the revolutionary cultural counter-movement that took place in the West as a reaction against the official ideologies that shoved European men to the apex of the human pyramid. This artistic movement, which stemmed from cultures described as primitive and savage, a stage below barbarian, was born out of the work of some thinkers and artists who found ways of doing and knowing among other peoples as complex as any in Europe and often virtually erased from European consciousness. By means of an ethnopoetics, it will be possible, as Rothenberg believes, to show how ethnographic revelations can change our ideas of poetic form and function. Hence, the participants are not only poets in an age of intermediate works and genre crossovers, but other artists as well, not only anthropologists and folklorists, but the indigenous poets and shamans for whom the others often act as conduits to the world of print and text. In a way, Rothenberg is proposing the dream of total art, that is, a complex redefinition of cultural and intellectual values by means of a new reading of past and present poetic representations. Relying on Robert Duncan's concept of a symposium of the whole, ethnopoetics in fact advocates a new artistic totality that will include many of the areas that have been consistently outcast by Western society at large. To compose such a symposium of the whole, such a totality, all the old excluded orders must be included. The female, the proletariat, the foreign, the animal and vegetative, the unconscious and the unknown, the criminal and failure. All that has been outcast and vagabond must return to be admitted in the creation of what we consider we are. The Irish lament poetry, whose ancestral origins date back to Elizabeth I's reign, in the form of the howls and wails of those women hired to wake the dead, has grown into a fundamental part in the studies of Irish folklore in its traditional form of the Caoineadh, or king, composed as a lament panegyric to be sung over the body of the dead. Thus, the keener or wailer becomes a funereal master of ceremonies, a sort of shamanic psychopomp, responsible for presiding the transition between life and death in so-called traditional communities. In this regard, one could argue that such tradition pervades Irish literature even through its most prestigious writers, such as J.M. Sain and James Joyce. In line with Angela Burke, Saint's theatre might be seen as part of the Caoineadh tradition. She has suggested that Saint would have known something about the Irish practice of lamentation before he heard women in Erin give voice to it, and proceeds to imply that the dramatist may have studied Caoineadh in works such as Thomas Crofton Crocker's Researches in the South of Ireland. Burke also proposes that the presence of keening women in Saint's theatre offer relatively recent and richly detailed accounts of the contexts in which the poetry of Caoineadh was composed and performed. The Irish scholar argues that Saint would have found a living theatre in the very practices of the Caoineadh he had witnessed, and thus proceeded to develop a set of dramatic techniques that allowed, by means of the performative nature of this Irish women's oral tradition, to provide him with a vessel with which he would carry on his own creativity onto the stage. In both Riders to the Sea and Deirdre of the Sorrows, same stage directions leave little doubt as to the assimilation of the legacy of the Irish oral tradition of lament poetry into his dramatis personae. Whereas in the first play, Saint directs that, quote, the women are keening softly and swaying themselves with a slow movement, unquote. When Bartley's body is brought in, during the second one, when Deirdre looks into the grave, the playwright's stage directions point out that, quote, she crouches down and begins swaying herself backwards and forwards, keening softly, unquote. Still in line with Berg, in writing not only such directions, but many a line to be spoken by his characters, Saint drew on his empathetic witnessing of individual women's performance at funerals, which ultimately gives structure to his plays over and above the subjective emotion they express. As for Joyce, his Finnegan's Wake, in all its awareness towards silence, in which, despite an apparent unreadability, moments of silent reverberations and nothingness are indeed woven into the text. It is also a book about the experience of loss. As Catherine O'Callaghan writes, Joyce's text memorializes to the greatest degree to which prose is capable the loss of loss itself. Even though Finnegan's Wake is ever escaping the usual classifications of a novel, as O'Callaghan goes through its myriad Irish phrases, she agrees that it gestures continuously towards a secret and silent center, indicative of an unspoken past, which can be read as a site of loss. Accordingly, as Judith Butler reflects on the origin of German tragic drama by Walter Benjamin, for whose history merges into the setting, the American gender theorist asserts that a certain problem of loss emerges when established narratives begin to falter. Joyce's book, in all its merging of content and form, which ultimately presents no actual narrative nor storyline, seems to, in following with O'Callaghan, hold out a message of redemption in the midst of loss. The portrayal of irrecoverability is a potent and political act of art. In terms of subject, she goes on to say that Finnegan's Wake revels in the notion of the fun-for-all, to be had at an Irish wake. While the text itself is in sympathy with the traditional Caoineadh or king, a ritualized lament performed at the graveside, which is both a lamentation and a socially licensed space for the cataloging of the deceased's foibles and the perceived injustices which had been performed against the deceased, the bereaved, or the community. Olivia Crulabelle's very watery words in her ultimate run down to the sea seem to echo not only Fionnuala's song of lament for the children of Lir, but also the haunting, keening sounds of mourning that evoke the ambivalence of a waking into the roaring sounds of final silence. And it's old and sad, and old, it's sad and weary, I go back to you, my cold father, my cold, mad father, my cold, mad, fury father, till the near sight of the mere size of him, the moils and moils of it, moan and moaning makes me sea silt, salt stick, and I rush my only into your arms. Joyce's textual deafening silences thus suggest his assimilation of the age-old Irish tradition of keening in all of its performative, paradoxical nature, namely, providing both an individual ritual for the dead and a space of communal catharsis for the living. Thus, as can be seen, from the Aran Islands to the shores of Moyle, all in all, the Caoineadh pervades the Irish social fabric into the myriad expressions to be found in some of the most notable literary voices across the land and beyond. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcel. I don't know if you want to go, if you could possibly just before we move on, show us your slides again, because I think, yeah, can you, just the slides,
each
one after one, just before we give voice to Pedro, please.
Okay, this is the slide that shows the dream of total art, which is part of the ethnopoetics theory, which is to render all sorts of literary production, poetry in particular, the status of a performative nature, in that it transcends the words put down in paper, if you will, and moves into a more synesthetic view of art, in which we would have music, light, dance, singing, theater, etc., which is the so-called dream of total art, or total translation, if you will. So this is also an idea of bringing about a symposium of the whole, which is part of this book by Rothenberg, displaying a range of discourse towards an ethnopoetics. This is a movement that took place in the 60s and 70s, as I said, as an attempt to render so-called primitive or ethnic or tribal poetry a status that had been denied or ever in terms of canonical Western literary representation. So my link to ethnopoetics and Irish studies is the Caoineadh, right? So now I show two ancient Greek ceremonies of lament panegyric, which is what the Irish Caoineadh is all about. That is, and it is usually performed and written, if you will, by female voices. And as we can see there, we find many women besides the deceased, and it's quite symbolic in that way. So I also made the link of these canonical Irish writers having themselves assimilated this oral tradition of panegyric poetry in the figures of Joyce and Synge. And then I went over Synge's stage directions and a few quoted lines from both Riders to the Sea and Deirdre of the Sorrows. And of course, his experience in the Aran Islands would have been the first ones in which he had witnessed firsthand the tradition of Caoineadh. And finally, I also dealt with Finnegan's Wake and its depiction of loss, or as the scholar would have it, the representation of loss in loss itself, and how in the very last words of Olivia Quillabelle, and this is a direct quote from her speech as she approaches the memorials, and how Joyce's significant attempts at representing silences throughout the book are also an echo of this age-old panegyric tradition of female voices in Ireland. And that is the last one with my email, in case anybody's interested in keeping in contact.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Thank you very much. I think your paper gives us a lot of food for thought, which I hope to expand when we come to our final moment of sharing ideas, comments, questions, and answers. And now we move on to Pedro Luís Sala Vieira. Pardon me. Pedro is licensed in Portuguese and English studies from 2015, and he holds a master's degree in applied linguistics since 2018 from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He's currently studying to obtain a PhD in contemporary literature from the Federal Fluminense University. And in his doctoral research, he intends to study and discuss Shakespearean intertextuality in the Brazilian translations of James Joyce's Ulysses. And his talk today is entitled Joyce and Shakespeare, the Shakespearian intertextuality in the Brazilian translations of Ulysses. So welcome, Pedro, and thank you for being with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. As Gisele has already said, my name is Pedro. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to present a part of my research of the PhD research that I'm studying right now at UFI in Rio de Janeiro. God. So let's go. Joyce and Shakespeare, the Brazilian translations of Ulysses. That's my research theme that I started this year at my PhD research. The intertextual connections between James Joyce and William Shakespeare are already largely known by scholars in general, and it has produced a number of studies on the subject. In my communication here, my purpose is to discuss this relation through the perspective of the Brazilian translations of Ulysses. Today, I would like to focus on the principle of this study, which lies on the very first chapter of the novel, that is Telemachus. And my purpose is to discuss how each of the three Brazilian translators approach the Shakespeare reference in their translation process. But before entering the presentation and discussion of the passages that I choose to discuss here, I want to talk briefly about some aspects of the relationship between the two authors, Joyce and Shakespeare, in order to illustrate the relevance of this connection in the translated texts. I think we should highlight at first what the figure of Shakespeare meant to Joyce. I call as ambivalent this imagery of Shakespeare and Joyce's perspective because at the same time Joyce regarded him as a kind of master to be followed, he also considered him as a kind of spectral figure in his novels. We have got examples of the construction of this image throughout the novel, but we will not be able to focus on them because of our time here. So, in the work on the theme, Laura Pelaccia argues that Shakespeare's existence in Joyce's work is tentacular because it entails several perspectives at the same time: cultural, structural, political, thematic, contrapuntal, imitational, quotational, misquotational, stylistic, psychological, psycholiterary. The same conception is contained in Harold Bloom's view of Joyce's work as Shakespeare-soaked epics. And Bloom also discussed in his well-known Western Canon the Joyce's agent with both Homer and Shakespeare in virtue of the fact that his text is founded simultaneously on the Odyssey and the Hamlet, while the reference to the Greek epic is already given in a certain way because we are used to read in generic representations of the novel that Ulysses is a parody of the Odyssey. The perception of Shakespeare's presence is only possible through reading and interpretation of Joyce's text. So, based on the Bloom's assumption that the writers must be in constant agony to find their own voice in their artistic path, as their predecessors were threatened to reduce the writers that follow them, Joyce's connection with Shakespeare is also contaminated by this anguish of influence resulting from the anxiety that all writers feel about the influence of those who precede them. So, for example, the character John Allenton in Ulysses, one of the scholars at the National Library in the 9th chapter, he rephrased Alexandre Dumas' Père when situates Shakespeare as divine figure by saying that after God, Shakespeare has created most. So, in the same chapter, Stephen names him as the playwright who wrote the folio of this world, referring to the first folio published posthumously that contained most of his plays. So, those remarks that relate Shakespeare to God is an expression of Joyce's view of Shakespeare as a progenitor, as someone who has come before him and created a work he admires. In other words, a sort of God, because he created a whole universe that is praised by the creatures unable to reproduce. But he doesn't see Joyce only as progenitor, but also as a predecessor and as a writer to follow. According to Harry Levin, Joyce seeks a guide in Homer and a father in Shakespeare, so the divine figure is a paternal one at the same time. So the other side of this ambivalence, of the supposed ambivalence that I'm talking about here, is completed by the assumption that Shakespeare acts as a kind of spectre in Joyce's work. And this is a very important thing when we discuss this relationship between them. I bring up this quotation by Benjamin Boysen in a paper that discusses the spectral presence of Shakespeare in his work, that reads like that: the living are haunted by history, tradition, all the dead generations and the predecessors who constitute this nightmare from which the living in vain, by means of a certain conjuration of the dead, are trying to awake. The spectre, that is, the predecessor, wakes, thinks, intensifies, and condenses itself within the very core of life. For that reason, intertextuality. When I talk here about intertextuality, it's a very complex topic that has been discussed by several scholars in many perspectives. But I would like to emphasize a few definitions before entering in the analysis. T.S. Eliot defines the relation between a work, defines intertextuality, although he did not use this word, as a relation between a work, a tradition, and a culture as a vast network of texts in which all other texts reside synchronously. Every author has and should have a historical consciousness, and no text exists of its own in the tradition. Julia Kristeva, who coined the term intertextuality, had a Bakhtini idea that any work of art is an intertext which interacts with the other texts, rewrites, transforms, or parrots them. Every text is a dialogical response to the other. Everything we read works as an intertext, according to her. Roland Barthes argues that a text can never be free from the network in which it's produced and always connects with other texts in this network, and it's a woven tissue, a text made up of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue. But every aspect of this multiplicity is unified in one place, the reception of the reader. So intertextuality is not only about the author's rewriting or absorbing a preceding text, but also the reader's reference to a text or other text already read. The meaning of a text is realized not only in the act of production, but also in the act of reception. Then we are talking about the negation of a fixed meaning lying outside the text or an original truth behind it. Rather, we refer to interpretation as a constant interaction between a reader and a text that produces an infinite flow of meanings, which means that text is an evolving, never-ending process. And this conception of text has very much to do with both Joyce's and Shakespeare's works, for different reasons that have been analyzed in multiple aspects throughout the century and will remain being so. Therefore, intertextual analysis requires that the reader or interpreter pursue the intertextual echoes in a text in order to get the text's meaning. So when referring to intertextuality and translation, it's inevitable to talk about the concept of memory as well. In this case, collective memory related to a specific cultural community. Memory has a strong connection with tradition and translation, because memory essentially means translating the past events through the sight of the present. So consider this matter of cultural memory. I also bring up an article by Fritz Sen, Yolanta Warinka, and Veronica Kovac, called The Spectral Shakespeare on Ulysses Translations, that discuss the same topic by analyzing Shakespeare reference and allusions in translations of Ulysses to several languages: French, Italian, German, Polish, Hungary. They examine the following question: how much Shakespeare, recognizable or not, is woven into the texture of translations? They come to a general conclusion that the very well-known quotes survive the transit easily, but that a lot of embedded Shakespeare will not make it into the translations, except by way of comments and notes. It means paratexts. So they also concluded that cultures that contain the canonical translations of Shakespeare's plays favor the detection of the Shakespeare existence, but the ones that did not have highly valued Shakespeare's translations resulted in a lesser recognition of the intertext. So consider this whole discussion that involves and connects tradition, translation, memory, and intertextuality. I finally get here to my study of the Shakespeare presence in the Brazilian translations of Ulysses. So everyone knows the translations by Antônio Wise, 1966, by Bernardino da Silveira Pinheiro in 2005, and Caetano Galindo in 2012. And I want to remind you before going into the analysis that this is an ongoing research at its very beginning. So I think I'm going to pose more questions than answers at this first moment. So, Shakespeare allusions are detected in the very first scene of the novel, primarily with regard to Hamlet's plot. The first one is Stephen's dream of his mother's ghostly reappearance on the top of the Martello Tower, which recalls the ghost appearance on the platform of Elsinore in the first act of the play. This is the first implicit reference. Haynes, the Englishman, living temporarily with them at the Martello Tower, with Stephen Daddles and Buck Mulligan. Martello Tower is a fort that serves as a home to them, describes the fort as similar to the towers and cliffs of Elsinore, the castle where the whole plot of the Shakespeare's play is set. He says like this: "This tower and these cliffs remind me somehow of Elsinore, that the Beatles over his basin into the sea, isn't it?" The highlighted sentence refers to Horatius' words in Hamlet's first act of the play, a description of the castle at the moment he attempts to persuade Hamlet not to follow his father's ghost, in face of the risk of Hamlet being led by the ghost to the depth of the sea. This is the passage I'm talking about. What if I tempt you toward the flood, my lord, or to the dreadful summit of the cliff, that the beetles over his basin into the sea, and there assume other horrible form, which might deprive your sovereign of reason and draw you into madness? Think of it. The translations of this passage into Portuguese have different options by them. Wise translated as que salta das suas bases sobre o mar, Pinheiro que se projeta acima de sua base sobre o mar, and Galindo lançando-as da base sobre o mar. Galindo's and Ruai's translations convey the idea of the castle's movement, giving it the status of an autonomous subject that comes up from the sea and stands by itself. These translations also follow the poetic pattern of decasyllable lines in order to correspond to the original iambic pentameter, as you can see in the sketch, in the division that you can see right now. The beetles over his basin to the sea, que salta de suas bases sobre o mar, lançando-as da base sobre o mar. Pinheiro, in her turn, translated it literally, que se projeta acima de sua base sobre o mar. Her decision did not take into account the intensity that is attributed to the castle in Horatius' original utterance, and as a consequence, the intention of a major comparison by Haynes trying to exalt the tower where they live is not present very well in her version. In her translation, did not follow the poetic pattern of the passage. Another example of this intertextuality is also referred to when Buck Mulligan calls Stephen fearful Jesuit when he was about to come up the stairs towards the top of the tower. Mulligan says, "Come up, Kinch, come up, you fearful Jesuit," which recalls the way Friar Lawrence called Romeo in the third scene of the third act of Romeo and Juliet. "Romeo, come forth, thou fearful man. Affliction is enamored both thy parts, and thou art wedded to calamity." In translations, they are read like that. Wise, suba quente, suba jesuíta execrado. Pinheiro translated as suba quente, suba seu temível jesuíta. And Galindo, sobe quente, sobe seu jesuíta medonho. So here we have different adjectives to refer to Stephen, and the use of fearful is related to the seriousness of the Jesuits and Mulligan looks over when regarding to Stephen. In the Shakespeare's play, the meaning relates to the anguish Romeo was feeling about the prince's decision on his banishment from Verona. We might interpret that Romeo causes fear as well because of his inconsequent actions and the many terrible events that followed his life throughout the play, although I think that the first meaning is more plausible to the context. So in translations, all the translations followed most of the meaning relate to the fear that Stephen provokes in virtue of his personality, which does not allow any kind of interpretation beyond this one. Then we move to the scene of the novel where they are taking shower at the beach, and Stephen thinks, speaking to me, they wash and tub and scrub, age and bite of Inuit, conscience. Yet here is Spot. The last sentence reflects the Macbeth theme where Lady Macbeth is sleepwalking and starts to hallucinate, trying to clean her hands from the blood of Duncan, the king that she plotted to murder along with her husband. In the translation, they appear this way. Ruais, falando para mim, lavam-se, limpam-se, esfregam-se, remordida do incenso, consciência, todavia, eis esta mancha. Pinheiro translate this way. Falando comigo, eles se lavam e se banham e se esfregam. Remorso de consciência. Consciência. No entanto, eis aqui uma mancha. And Galindo, falando comigo, eles se lavam e se limpam e se esfregam. Remorsura do intelecto. Consciência. E, no entanto, eis uma mancha. The spots in Joyce technically refers to the bath the characters are taking at the moment of his reflection, but in Macbeth it's very symbolic because it regards to the consequence of the characters' actions to their own psychological state because of the blame they feel from the murdering acts. In this case, we do not have a larger difference in the translation because although we may point that each translation situates the spot in different ways. Weiss defines the spot as esta mancha, creating a sense of closeness to it. Pinheiro employed aqui, that also changed somehow the perspective because it creates the imagery that the spot is situated somewhere in the physical world. And Galindo's translation focuses on the independence of the spot by using uma mancha and keeps the openness of interpretation that this spot may occur at this moment. So, the examples that I discussed here are just the first step of research that intends to develop a referential corpus to discuss each one of the translation process. We observed here different approach on the Shakespeare presence in Joyce's novel and highlight and emphasize here the importance of focus on this intertextuality when studying translations in general. So future research intends to perform a critical and analytical description of the translator's decision regarding the Shakespeare references in Joyce's work and demonstrate how the translators approach the relationship with the board and thus develop a critical reflection on the translations. Finally, it expects to contribute to the field of translation studies with a focus on literary intertextuality in translated text and also bring about another perspective towards the Brazilian versions of Joyce's novel. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And I think now we can open for questions and answers. And I remind those who arrived after we started that Vitor Alevato is giving his talk on Friday because he had some personal issue for the afternoon. He couldn't be with us in this panel, but he's talking on Friday morning. So now I think we can open for questions or comments. If you want to open your mic or write in chat, and we can start our dialogues, please. Participants are all welcome at this point. While people are warming up, I will start saying that I think the two talks are very interesting and very much in dialogue, in the sense that Marcel brought the idea of oral literary tradition and tradition, and how the two come up with ethnopoetics, reminding redemption and loss in writing, in Irish writing. So I really thank Marcel for this wonderful opportunity of dialoguing about tradition and oral tradition in Irish literature, and how the two dialogue. And then Pedro's talk, bringing the idea of tradition for translators and for readers and for writers. And I kept thinking, while Pedro was speaking, I kept thinking on how we as critics or even just readers have the tendency to try and locate writers in the tradition, and how the dialogue with tradition helps us do that task, you know. And then the importance of that to writers, and now through Pedro's talk, the importance of that to translators. So I'm really glad we can have the two talks together, because they bring perspectives that are very dialogic. And I also wondered how much this is important for writers. How do they feel about locating themselves as regards the tradition? For example, in the case of Joyce, once you mentioned Joyce and Shakespeare, how conscious was all the intertextuality in his work, and in the sense of making himself into the tradition. And on the other hand, Marcel's talk, going back to Robert Duncan's idea and ethnopoetics and the Symposium of the whole, quite interesting as well. So let me see what we have here in chat. Everybody thanking you both again. Thank you very much. Pedro, I have a question. I have a few questions, so I'll start. If no one else starts, I'll start. How do you feel the importance of tradition for translators? Because I remember reading and even hearing from Galindo that when he prepared his latest translation of Ulysses, his latest translation of Joyce, he never consulted. He never went back to what had already been done, because he just wanted the exercise of translation. So he wasn't, I mean, the tradition for him would be a kind of burden in his own translation task. So how have you been thinking about it? Is tradition more important for the writer or for the translator? What would you say about that?
I think I would guess it's more important for the writer, because the writer, he or she is a part of the tradition intrinsically. When the writer decides that he's going to publish a book, he's going to write anything, he's coming to a tradition that's already established, right? That's the anguish that Bloom talks about. That's the anxiety that the spectral presence of Shakespeare and Joyce is related somehow to this tradition that all the writers are going into. So I think tradition is more important for the writer. But in translation, I agree that Galindo, I understand that Galindo did not want to see what has been done, in the sense that he did not see other translations, right? Am I right? Isn't it?
Yeah, he cared less for what had already been done. And then he just wanted to do. I mean, he was asked, so how would you compare what Pinheiro had already done, Joyce had already? So how would you situate yourself there in the middle of the tradition of translators? And he said, I don't care. I just wanted to have it done. And I think this is kind of brave of him to say, because usually not only translators but writers have that concern, let me try to be in between, because it's more than intertextuality there. I would think of transtextuality. Texts a long time, a long century, and then translations in between, So I think Galindo was brave, but maybe there's some practical issue there regarding time. You know, we don't have much time in life, and I think if anyone has a contract with a publishing house, and you have to do it, and even being an academic, which means you are supposed to check what's being done, you have no time, so you just do it. And I think that's the brave attitude of someone who's willing to do. Sometimes we are stuck in doing because we think, oh, everything has already been done. And I think Beethoven, my colleague Beethoven from UFI, in one of our NTC's talk, you know, one of the talks we had in Núcleo de Tradução e Criação, one of the things he said is many times students enter university and with one desire, and they finish university course with a totally different perspective from the beginning in terms of what they wanted and what they end up doing, even after 20 years of doing something, mostly because of the burden of tradition, which makes me go back to Marcel's talk on oral tradition or orality and marginality. You know, now 21st century is the time for marginality. Everything, everyone, and those who inhabit marginality are very welcome. Those who are central are not welcome anymore. So it's the time for marginality. So what do we do with tradition? And how do we deal with Shakespeare and Joyce?
Yeah, the very existence of a marginality presupposes the existence of a tradition, right? I think that's the anguish point that I was talking about. The tradition is somehow inevitable, because even when you are going to the margins of the tradition, you are somehow related to the tradition because you are on the margins of it. So I think this anguish and this anxiety, that contaminates, that Bloom talks about, and that Benjamin Boysen also talks about, is related to this inexplicable, this intrinsic intrinsicality that you are somehow stuck in a tradition. It's a burden. I agree with this. It's somehow a burden, but it's a burden that is inevitable for the writers and somehow for the translation, because translators are writers too, in a certain sense. They are rewriting a work. So Galindo, when translating Joyce, he's going to approach several intertexts that are in Joyce's work. So he's going to deal with a literary tradition embedded in Joyce's work. It's somehow inevitable. So, but I agree that it may be a burden. It may be a burden, yes. The canon, the tradition. I agree with this perspective. It's very complex, very complicated.
Let me ask Marcel, what's your idea of having such beautiful and important project in Brazil or from the Brazilian academic world, you know, dealing with foreign, because I think we live in a kind of schizophrenic environment, dealing and talking about foreign literatures of the English language from Brazil. What would you have to say about this? And my initial idea here is, of course, translation and the role of translation, but maybe you have some more thoughts on this. I think this challenge. I think it's a great challenge to do work on literary studies that are from abroad, within our country, and from the, you know, from Portuguese language perspective and Brazil in particular.
Well, thanks very much for the question. I think it's great, actually, that we as marginal nations in the third world are able to somehow tackle these established canonical literary traditions of, say, in our case, literatures in English, Irish literature in particular. And I also think that in terms of translation, in terms of this particular dichotomy between the so-called original and the different forms of translation that Pedro showed us brilliantly in the case of our three Brazilian translators. I think we've come a long way from the times of intertextuality in the first half of the 20th century with the movement we now refer to as modernism, into which Joyce and all the great modernists are inserted. And for them, the matter of intertextuality was a matter of existence, right? After Ezra Pound declared that we are at the nadir of literature, I think there was a conscious attempt, if you will, on the part of artists in general and writers in particular, to turn that mirror that Hamlet had once taught us to be held up against nature, that had in due time be turned against the author's subjectivity with the Romantics. And with these modernist writers of the first half of the 20th century, that in fact dealt with the movement that, unlike all other previous schools of the ages, was actually not philosophically rooted as all other previous movements. This was an altogether artistic tendency, if you will. So they were making this conscious attempt at turning that mirror up against art itself. So the question of intertextuality flourished as never before. And of course, that created a sort of abysmal gap, if you will, between the works of art and common readership. It took scholars decades to come to terms with Ulysses. If it was not for Stuart Gilbert's book on how to read Ulysses, we would probably be still sort of groping in the dark as to what all those intertextual narratives were telling us about. And still, the book that I just brushed a little bit onto, The Finnegan's Wake, we are still, even though under the almighty powers of the postmodern oracle of Google, we are still at loss when we tackle a book that is about loss itself, right? So, in terms of the original and the translation, I think the great Algerian philosopher Jacques Derrida, he once said that there is no such thing as an original, right? I think Pedro also talked a little bit about that. It's all about translations, right? So Ulysses itself is a myriad, layered voice of translations of so many texts, right? He visits and revisits all schools of the ages, and he attempts at building this somehow ethnopoetic dream of total art in a book that he at first sent to his editor with no title. So that was too much, right? Apparently the editor would have told Joyce, well, this is almost unreadable, but I would need a title, right? And the moment he gave it Ulysses, I mean, people could hardly understand at all what he meant by giving it such titles, since the book was itself at first hand not about the Odyssey, and it took a while for scholars to actually come to grips with it. So I think, coming back to your original question, it's a great thing that we've moved from the intertextual matters of the first half of the 20th century into the transtextual approaches that we may have now in this postmodern world of shattered identities, in which I suppose that mirror that was once held up against nature to be held up against the subjectivity and then to be held up against itself has been shattered and broken up in a million pieces in these times that are all about, as the great Baudrillard would put it, simulacra, right? So I think it's a great job that Pedro showed us here of the attempt at encompassing and somehow making it possible to follow not only the structure in terms of content, but also the structure in terms of form, which after all is the power of language per se, right? So I maybe get too carried away by your question, but
great, that's great. No, you brought up many other issues. Thank you very much, Marcel. I think you brought me, for example, the idea that many people dealing with Shakespeare end up in Joycean studies and vice versa. You know, even in Brazil, we have people like Donald Schuller, big translator of Joyce, and José Roberto Che from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, both translate both authors. They are both translators of Joyce and Shakespeare. In Portugal, there's Rui Carvalho Homem, who is a critic of Shakespeare, a translator of Shakespeare, and a critic of in Irish studies, and particularly in Joycean studies as well. So I think, well, so much has been said. You know, we are open if participants want to send us comments or the questions. I don't know. I have so many, but I think the theme is really wide and brings us many other questions related to the themes. For example, in Marcel, nobody comments, so I will continue. Whenever there's a comment in chat or anyone wants to speak, I'll shut up. For example, Marcel mentioned John Milton Synge and Riders to the Sea and the Aran Islands. And I kept thinking on the mixture of genre and how does it matter to the critic, but not so much to the translator. And again, the dichotomy between marginality and center, and how, because in Marcel's talk, it was clear that sometimes, or most of the times, whoever is marginal at a certain period in history, which was the case of Joyce, in the future ends up being central. So the position that authors occupy along the centuries change completely, even for Shakespeare and for his works. And again, oral tradition is there. I mean, poetry is orality to start with, but nowadays oral poetry is maybe less and less celebrated. Maybe now with the internet and with all this new form of communication, maybe it comes back as a central genre.
Yes, I'm not sure if I should comment on that, but thanks for your comments anyway. I think Pedro also briefly touched on this question, which is a matter of the anxiety of influence, as Bloom would have it. The matter of avoiding Shakespeare is what any sort of writer, marginal or canonical, should refrain from, right? So the spectral presence, as Pedro also talked about, of Hamlet's father's ghost, is to be found throughout not only Joyce's Ulysses, but most of so-called canonical writers, right? In terms of how it makes itself present through myriad allusions in intertextual or transtextual references and quotations that might or might not be as apparent as one would have them to be. But also, I suppose, because you mentioned the topic of oral tradition and how it's been sort of put aside, and how it's somehow trying to regain ground from having been marginalized and outcast for so long, right? So I think oral tradition is part of this performative nature of art in general, poetry in particular, that we have more and more forgotten about, and that critics and scholars at large tend to disconsider or overlook, right? That poetry is something to be not only read, but mostly read aloud and performed, if you will, in order to render it its performative, oral, traditional aspect that also somehow triggers the concept of the power of literature relying on figurative language, right? You see, I usually tell my students about how literature precedes language in terms of the figures of speech. And usually people tend to think of oral tradition also preceding the written tradition. And the archaeology of linguistics, if you will, tends to show otherwise, that the many of the first actual attempts at communication in our prehistoric past stem from actually written forms, so that they appeared by means of, say, pictographs or drawings in ancient Chinese bird trails on sand, way before our vocal cords had developed enough for us to be able to tackle the miracle of the advent of language, which is in itself also something that remains mysterious, even for the so-called science of linguistics, right? The advent of language is something that has not been established historically and is still veiled in mystery. And I also usually tell them how the matter of literature preceding language itself in terms of our prehistoric past. You see, the figures of speech themselves precede both oral in our current understanding, modern understanding of writing language, in terms of those prehistoric men having drawn those figures that we recognize now as the cave paintings, and how those were in fact figures that in due time become figures of speech, and how those somehow precede the very guttural sounds that would in due time appear more or less or not at all in congruence with so-called written speech, right? So, well, I'm rambling now. Sorry about that, guys.
This matter of tradition that she was talking about earlier, and the fact that Shakespeare is present in several literary works, even in Brazilian culture, we can see several references of Shakespeare in Machado de Assis' works, for example. So, if you talk about the Shakespeare intertextuality, we go through several literary works. It's never going. It's a never-ending process, right? Just like literary tradition, literary canon is develops itself. So so when I talk here about Shakespeare and Joyce, I just want to highlight that it's not like Joyce only exists because of Shakespeare, or Joyce tries to be like Shakespeare or mean the same thing as Shakespeare in the English speaking language tradition. Just to highlight the fact, I just in my presentation and trying to bring it to discuss to the discussion of the translation that the Shakespeare presence in Ulysses is so strong, is something so how can I say intrinsic that we are. It keeps I wonder when I started studying this matters. I wonder how, if is it possible to read Joyce without reading Shakespeare. It's a question that I constantly pose to myself, because we know that we do not need to read Odyssey to try to understand Joyce, but do we need to know all the Shakespearean reference to understand Joyce? That's a question that I pose myself, because in the English-speaking communities, they have the Shakespeare references are very some they are part of their culture, right? It's embedded, it's intrinsic to their cultures, but it's not we cannot say the same of Brazilian culture and other cultures. So that's a question that I pose to myself that maybe I'm going to discuss during my research. So that's my final remark on this, on the whole subject.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm sorry I missed the middle of Marcel's comment.
Yeah, you didn't miss much. That's fine. I was rambling mostly.
I doubt it. But I'm curious about your mentioning the Symposium of the Whole. If you could talk more about that, I am very interested in that.
Yes, well, that was, as I said, this artistic movement in the United States in the 60s, in the 70s, led by Rothenberg and George Quasha and Robert Duncan, in which they followed the line and the lead of romantic idealists in terms of trying to comprise so-called marginalized artists, as I said, all sorts of outcast voices such as the female, the proletariat, very much in the line of what the Romantics tried to do. That is, to find a way to make language turn into an idiom that would somehow show the true essence in the heart of simple men, right? But that called my attention when I was, like I suppose everybody else was, watching Banville's talk 2 days ago, and when he said that, because Ulysses itself is allegedly this story about the anti-hero ordinary men, right? But then Banville said, well, there's no such thing. There's no ordinary men. Nobody's ordinary, right? Everybody's special in their own terms. So I suppose still Rothenberg and friends' attempt at building this Symposium of the Whole in order to render artistic representation their primitive dream of total art and of total translation, in order to, in a way, also make clear that shift that occurred in the 19th century from religion to literary discourse in terms of its being back then and still the ultimate translators of the sacred, right? It seems that it fell on the shoulders of religion for a long time to translate those ineffable messages of the Mysterium Fascinosum, if you will. And as of the 19th century onwards, religion lost its magic, and that has ever since fallen on our shoulders, right? Literary critics, scholars, and artists as well, or mostly. That is what is behind Rothenberg's attempt in trying to build such a symposium, right? Trying to have a grasp at what Emerson would have called the primordial unity, right?
Perfect, thank you. And I think the echoes of their work, I see pretty much, they're happening nowadays, maybe from the last 20 years. I remember being in contact with other poets in Portugal and how the influence of Robert Duncan had on their own productions. And not only in their own productions as poets, but as translators as well. So I think, it takes time for things to evolve into the, for projects to turn the way their inventors or creators imagined. Maybe this time is becoming shorter and shorter with technology, or maybe not. I don't know. This is something to be investigated. But I think, for example, with the widespread of computers writing, the task of writing brought that idea that time for the writer had changed, in the sense that many people started typing instead of writing their little notebooks. People carry notebooks in their bags or pockets, and now they needed just a screen or a typewriter or a computer to write on. And now even more. So I don't know. This is something to be investigated on. Maybe Pedro has some answer in that regard as he goes over the translators of such writers. But I felt, going what Marcel mentioned, I felt John Banville's talk quite pessimist, in a sense, even though I loved I loved listening to his words, I felt him a bit pessimist. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, it didn't strike me as such, but maybe I'm too much of a fan in order to have gotten what you did. But I think it's just brilliant, and it was such a rare opportunity to have him look at the seagulls and get inspiration before he addressed the questions and the comments. It's just wonderful. But perhaps, I don't know, maybe you have more information on his work than I would, and you sensed something there that might have been overlooked by such a neophyte in Irish studies as myself. So, not sure,
Let's keep that conversation going for future perspectives. I'm not sure. I would have to go back to the talk. And actually, I'm glad all these talks are being recorded and are going to be available at update channels. So.
Yeah, so not so sure about ours being recorded after so much rambling, but still, Banville's is a gift.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. If there are no further comments or questions, we are going to start resuming.
Okay, Gisele, thank you very much for moderating. You've done a great job, and Pedro as well for sharing such a wonderful work in progress with us all. Thanks, Jessica, for the beautiful tips as well, and for being there.
Thank you, Marcel. Lovely hearing your talk and your comments. Great lesson. And Pedro and all the participants, thank you very much for being here. Very interesting moment of sharing knowledge. So I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for being in touch.
Thank you for the opportunity of sharing my work, my research, and thank you for the discussion, the feedback. Thank you for coming, all the participants too.